Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome to the Weather Channel's Facebook Live feed. This is our 1 o'clock update. I'm here with storm specialist Dr. Greg Postel, who's been here all morning tracking everything to do with Hurricane Matthew, a Category 4 hurricane making its approach to Florida overnight tonight into tomorrow morning with significant impacts to come. Dr. Postel, tell us about it a little bit.
Well, you know what, last night when I was watching this thing really closely, the pressure was up around 960 millibars and the winds were about 125 miles per hour. But overnight, as it was moving through the Bahamas, it got a little bit more reorganized, better organized. Pressure came down, now down to 940 millibars, so it came down about 20 millibars. And it took a little time for the winds to catch up to that. There's a little adjustment process that happens, and this morning we saw that uptick in the winds to 140. The fastest, though, recon observation that I could find was about 130 miles per hour. So whether it's 130 or 140, guys, it's a Cat 4, and it is moving that direction toward the Florida coast. And there's some good news in the fact that this is not the biggest of all hurricanes. Brandon, you and I were looking at the size of the hurricane wind field, and it is actually pretty compact around the center.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, on satellite presence at least, there seems to be a little bit of degradation, especially compared to, say, prior to the landfall in Haiti and in Cuba a couple of days ago. Right. It seems to have at least structure weakened a little bit. Now, that's not going to necessarily change what you see in terms of surge or what you see in terms of potential wind impacts, especially with the core of that eye making a close approach.
Right.
But overall, it seems to be on a downward trend in some ways.
Let's hope it. I mean, the official forecast from the Hurricane Center keeps it at 145. So we're going with that for a very close encounter with the coast. That would be the worst part of it, the eye wall, about midnight tonight. And the most destructive part of the hurricane in terms of wind will be in that eye wall. That's where you'll have the hurricane force winds and winds potentially over 100 miles per hour on the beach and to some extent inland, at least a few miles, depending on exactly where that center goes. Alan, can you get that? Let's keep it here for a second. Let's keep it here. So this is what Brandon and I are talking about. The hurricane force winds are confined to this small area right in here within about 30 miles of the center. There's a lot of rain shower activity that is now closing in on southeast Florida. These rain bands will likely produce wind gusts over 30 or 40 miles per hour as they move in. And in Miami, I don't think you'll see much more than that. Matthew may be making its closest approach to Miami right about now. It's about 150 miles offshore, but it is going in that direction. So it's going to get a lot closer to Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, Fort Pierce, Juneau, and all the way up to the Space Coast. So there, the weather conditions are going to progressively get worse and worse and worse. And if you end up finding yourself in this eye wall, be prepared for wind gusts over 100 miles per hour.
Exactly. So as this eye makes its closest approach overnight, let's zoom in because Nassau earlier, Malkoff was up with his shot, and it was a fantastic shot. But I think the core of everything with the winds passed just to the west.
That's right.
So it seemed like Nassau was spared a little bit. Now, hopefully we can say the same thing for everybody that was on the other islands of the Bahamas, Nicholstown, and then ultimately as well on the Florida coast. But even if you don't get the core of the winds, there are other effects from these hurricanes in general, and specifically from Matthew, that will lead to some serious issues. For example, the storm surge flooding, which I know that's something that you have been extremely concerned about.
Yes, I totally think that this is potentially the most devastating part of this, as is with hurricane landfalls in general. The most risk to life and property comes from storm surge flooding. And we do think that now up the Florida coast, especially along and north of where the center goes, there could well be devastating inundation from storm surge, wave run-up, and everything else. And I encourage you all to go to nhc.noaa.gov, and on that website there are storm surge inundation links where you can go there, and it's a map-based form of how much water rise could potentially happen for various locations, and it's almost down to a neighborhood by neighborhood sort of view. You can really zoom in on your area, and therefore, for example, I'll say up in this Cape Canaveral area, there's going to be places that may be under 9 feet of water, and that is a very, very, very dangerous forecast. to be fair, those storm surge graphics that are shown on that website are, quote, worst case scenario. It is not likely to exceed that. Only they think a 10% chance of exceeding those values. But the idea is that life-threatening inundation could occur all the way up the Florida coast, and in particular in the North Florida coast, southern Georgia coast, and maybe even getting into parts of southern South Carolina, depending on where the track goes. Because if the center is here, you're going to develop a strong east wind here that's going to pile up a lot of water, and it's not just going to be at the beach or the east-facing shores. It's going to be moving in through parts of the rivers and the inlets, and all into interior parts of Florida are going to see water rises that they may not be prepared for.
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing about the northeast Florida coast and Georgia as well is with the concave nature of the coast, a lot of times if you get a hurricane that rolls up the east coast, well, as it's here close, well, it's a couple hundred miles offshore here, and it's close again in the Carolinas, you don't get a lot of landfalls from hurricanes. The hurricane record is very sparse for the past 50 years or so. You have to go back to the late 1800s to have big hurricanes impacting northeast Florida and Georgia. So this is something that not only you haven't seen in your lifetime, but just there's not been a lot of experience with it anybody has dealt with. And now with the population increases in Florida over the past 10 years, I think it's 2 million more people have moved into Florida since 2005, and we haven't had a lot of hurricane experience in general. A lot of people are not going to be prepared for this in an area that is vulnerable to this, both from geography and from everything else.
Everyone's asking about that website, and if you can repeat it again.
Yes, it's nhc.noaa.gov. It's the National Hurricane Center's website, where I encourage you to go there and just scroll down. There's a little section there that's Hurricane Matthew, and there's a little link there that says Storm Surge Inundation. And you can click on that, and from there you are shown a map of the United States, in this part of the United States, and you can zoom in and click on or zoom into an area, and you can see a color-coded basis the water rise level that is, in their mind, a worst-case scenario, but a level at which you should prepare for. So that's something very, very, very important with this, because as Brandon and I have been talking about, all along the Florida coast, and the Georgia coast, the South Carolina coast, there may be storm surge values that they have never seen before.
Exactly. And on our maps for the Weather Channel here, basically we're going with what the National Hurricane Center actual forecast is. If you go to their text products, this is what they're doing, but they've gone even better with the website that Dr. Postell is talking about. Alan, can you just pull it up, even if it's just them running the map, just so we can see it?
Just to show, give you an example of when you go on
so
your
you
web browser,
right,
what it looks like. Oh, this is what it looks
fantastic.
like. Yeah.
So basically, they've gone through and they're actually running a computer model and doing this based off of localized locations. So, we put 6 to 9 for this whole area, but it's not everybody going to see 6 to 9 foot surge. There's actually places that will only see, for example, a 1 foot surge issue or a 3 foot issue, but they've done it on a much more localized level. So this website is invaluable if you live along the coast.
Absolutely, and this doesn't show it, but if you go up the beach, unfortunately we can't roll this up, we're sort of limited here with the graphics, but the idea is if you go up the beach in Florida, there's a significant inundation potential well inland. Just looking at it earlier today, I was looking close into Jacksonville, and in the St. Johns River, there's going to be significant water rises there, potentially 1 to 3 feet, maybe even 3 to 6 feet. Some places that have normally dry ground that far inland are going to see water rises due to the storm surge, the wave run up, and everything associated with that onshore east wind with Matthew. Do you have any more questions?
Yeah, we're going to ask quite a few times about the potential of it going from a Cat 4 to a Cat 5.
I think that's unlikely. I really do. I know there's been some noise on social media that this could go beyond into Cat 5. It's not impossible, but it is not the most likely scenario. We've been holding steady now at 940 millibars or so, and the winds have now caught up to that 940 millibar pressure. So what would have to happen is I think we would have to see some internal structural changes, the reorganization and an improvement in the organization in the inner core, in and near the eye, for the pressure to come down more, and then the winds could catch up to that. I think that is not likely. Bottom line, it's a lot of talk. I think it is unlikely to become Cat 5. Even when you look at the satellite presentation, Alan, if we can...
We're moving to Jacksonville.
Oh, you're going to move to Jacksonville? Okay.
We're gonna do it.
So let me say one thing. We'll get to the satellite presentation in a second, but it doesn't look like it's on the mode of intensification anytime soon, and we can hope that stays the case all the way to the beach. I think that's the most likely scenario.
Yeah, we're simply, more than anything, probably just starting to run out of time. Yes, the water is warm.
Yep.
Yes, there's probably a good depth of warm water, but we're a matter of 100 to 150 miles from closest approach both to Miami, but also ultimately to Fort Pierce and then the rest of the Florida coast. I mean, I would imagine this is, 175 miles at most?
Something like that from Fort Pierce down.
And so with a forward speed of 12 to 15 miles an hour, you figure
11, 12 hours.
Yeah, exactly. So if you are on the Florida coast and in the hurricane warning, if you've not completed your preparations by now, hours need to be finishing those preparations tonight. The conditions will only go downhill from there. If you're in Georgia, they've now announced that if you are east of I-95 in any of the 6 coastal counties in the state of Georgia, mandatory evacuation is now in effect. So check with your local emergency managers. Obviously, we're having them on here on the Weather Channel as well. You can tune in on the Weather Channel and watch that. But check in with them. Find out, do you have a mandatory evacuation? Do you have voluntary evacuation? Check your routes. If you're staying, you need to finish preparations today in Florida, and very soon in Georgia and South Carolina as well. If you're going, find your route. Go to those websites and be ready to go.
Let's do the timing. Let's do the timing with the wind forecast. Brandon, that's excellent information. Going from this afternoon, this is one forecast model's interpretation of what's going to happen, right? There are a bunch of different forecasts, and some of them may be a little bit different. And it's important to know that little wiggles in a track will matter a lot because of the compactness in nature of the very high winds. But let's just assume this model is right, and there's reason to suspect it's certainly very close to that. Midnight tonight, the eye wall, the western eye wall, may be on the coast of Florida, near West Palm Beach. That would probably bring wind gusts in, say, around 100, maybe a little over that miles per hour in this zone. The strongest of all the winds would remain over water. That's just the case with landfalling hurricanes. And then as we go through the morning hours tomorrow, this model has the center paralleling the coast. But the problem is the storm surge threat, because that, along and north of the center, you have that very powerful east wind sending the water westward. And that may bring significant storm surge, perhaps in excess of 9 feet in places like Merritt Island, Cape Canaveral, in and near that whole area, Space Coast of Central Florida.
And it's not just on the coast.
Right.
In this case, especially in the Space Coast area, you've got all of this inland areas. You've got, other waterways and other features, rivers, creeks, and all that stuff. I mean, this is not even getting into the Jacksonville discussion. You're going to bring all that wind and water across and into interior areas. You're like, I live 5 miles from the coast. Well, it may not necessarily matter in this case. And then you get up into Jacksonville, and to further Dr. Postel's point, with St. Johns River, you're going to sit there and bring that east wind just persistent and run water potentially up the river.
Let me say one other thing. Can you back it out to about when it was off, say, Vero Beach, maybe just south of Cape Canaveral, somewhere in here? Now, there's a lot of folks who live inland as well, and I want to give you sort of an estimate of what you can expect if you live, say, 10, 20 miles from the coast. The winds are going to rapidly decrease. The farther inland you go, especially if you get a north or a west wind, that wind is going to be a lot less than the wind you have at the beach. The Category 3 or Category 4 winds are, in this scenario with the storm paralleling the coast, just like that. The Cat 3 and Cat 4 winds are not going to be 10 miles inland. You may get wind gusts over 80 miles per hour briefly, but that's about it. If this scenario holds out and we don't get this thing bodily moving into Florida, which seems unlikely, the winds rapidly decrease the farther inland you go by a lot. So that's one of the characteristics of landfalling hurricanes, and there's no expectation that this would be any different. In fact, this model has winds of 50 to 60 miles per hour in, for example, western Brevard County or western Volusia. So that's the kind of gradient in wind speed we're talking about. The real destructive part of the wind field is going to be with this eye wall right in here, especially on the north side of the storm, where along the beach you could get winds over 100 miles per hour.
And that's even reflected in the NHC's watches and warnings. You can almost take that map and see the exact same thing happening because they have hurricane warnings along the coast, and including Orlando. But if you go just across that next set of counties, it's down to only a tropical storm warning because they expect only winds gusting into tropical storm range, maybe close to hurricane gusts, but otherwise It's just along the coast as it moves up quickly along the coast.
I would even contend that a lot of these counties inland are not going to see hurricane force winds if the track verifies. If the track moves along like that, one county inland from the beach, you're not going to see sustained hurricane force winds. You may get gusts that high in some of the heavier rain bands, but this is not one of those hurricanes where you have hurricane force winds extending out 100 miles. They're inside of 30 miles. It's a fairly tight circulation for now, and it's not much more time before it gets very close to the Florida coast. There's not much time for structural change, I don't think.
Yeah, certainly not upward. Maybe a little degradation as it,
Yeah.
if it doesn't ever fully recover. Alan, pull up the like an RPM or the HRRR or something, so we can kind of show that core. Not just we showed it in the wind form. Let's show it in a simulated radar form, so you can see kind of see what you're going to look at tomorrow morning when you wake up or this evening. So there's your RPM. Now you get the idea. There's the core of the hurricane with the strongest winds, and again, still just offshore, maybe grazing the coast. And once it does, that's where you have the most significant impacts from both the wind and then from the surge as well. And it's just running right up the coast all the way.
Right. The strongest of all the winds are right in here, right? Assuming that this verifies, right in here, and those will be moving up the coast. Now, there is some good news is that, if half the circulation is overland, if the center follows the coast like that, can you back it up, Alan, just a little bit, go a little bit farther south to where the center, say, east of Daytona Beach, right about there. Okay, so think about this. Half the circulation is overland, so the system is overall going to be weakening on the northward path, even though the center is right here. You're going to have howling winds, perhaps gusting over hurricane force right in here in that zone. But once you get inland, you're going to see dramatically improved conditions. But let's now bring it up to Georgia and South Carolina, because this is important. You too, in Savannah and Hilton Head Island and in Charleston and many other places here, are going to have a prolonged east wind at high amplitude. I mean, you're going to have potentially hurricane force wind gusts here as well, and that's going to lead to significant flooding. I think those storm surge inundation maps will be very valuable as we go through the day tomorrow to look at up here. Right now, they're maybe not showing a ton, but as the forecast gets more confident in the position of Matthew up in there, they will tune those inundation maps to give you a better estimate of what to prepare for tomorrow in this area, North Georgia, or I should say the coastal Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina for the potential for storm flooding.
Exactly, which is why I believe right now there's only storm surge watches posted up through that far.
Right.
It's more of a timing issue. A watch is issued with 36 hours from the onset, and a warning is issued at
I think 48.
48 and 36. Yeah, 48 hours for a watch, 36 hours for a warning. And so, as you get into that time frame, they will then change it to a warning. They'll run their models, they'll update their forecasts, and you will see a very different thing, different look of that tomorrow. Which is also why now the hurricane warnings have been extended up beyond Florida into Georgia, into parts of South Carolina. We're now in that time frame of the potential for the hurricane winds coming tomorrow and Saturday.
Yeah, we're actually getting asked quite a few questions about Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and about Wilmington specifically, and how the impacts are going to be across the coast, I suppose, everywhere above Florida.
Yeah, there may be hurricane force wind gusts as the center of Matthew, we think, probably stays along or just off the coast. I don't think it's going to be a Category 4 by the time it's up here, and that's reflected, I think, in the Hurricane Center's official forecast. But there is some suggestion that if the circulation gets close enough to the coast along the Florida coast, bad news for them. But as I mentioned earlier, the circulation will be weakening on its northward progress. So if it stays up in here, with that east wind, you may get your hurricane force wind gusts in Savannah, in Charleston, and on even up into Wilmington. But as I said, outside of that eye wall, the conditions are radically better. So if the hurricane were supposed to move about like this, it will gradually increase its distance from the North Carolina coast. So the risk to North Carolina to see those hurricane force winds and significant storm surge flooding is less than it is in South Carolina. But there's time to sort all this out because the track, will be wiggling around a little bit as we go forward in time.
Exactly, and again, remember about the cone, and we've done a couple of explainers on this. We try to talk about this as much as possible. The cone is where the National Hurricane Center thinks the center of the hurricane will go. That's not necessarily to say that you won't see impacts outside of the cone here or here. It's just that center point of the hurricane in this area. And of course, there is a forecast center track, but you still can see impacts outside of it. And additionally, the the center of the storm can actually pass outside of the cone. That happens from time to time as well. Do you want to explain the funky looking cone while we're here?
Yeah.
A couple days ago, the European model ECMWF came up with this bizarre solution, and you thought, what the heck is that? Where what it did was it took Matthew in about a path like this, brought it back this way next week, and kind of hung it out here for a while. And there were some solutions that brought it closer to the coast. Some brought it out, but the idea is that the ECMWF model was the first one to introduce this kind of hooking pattern here with the center of Matthew late in the weekend and early next week, and a lot of the other guidance has since now caught on. So this now is reflected in the cone with reasonable, reasonable certainty that Matthew will come back out over here and hang out potentially for a while, but in a much weakened state. That's critical.
Actually getting asked if Tropical Storm Nicole is having any effect on Matthew and its movements.
It's a little too hard to unpack the specific relationship between the two. There's a lot going on. There are much larger and significant steering currents associated with Matthew. There's Nicole. If you could back out on this to show
Actually,
you.
just take a generic
Satellite
satellite.
picture.
That'll
Good
work-
idea.
That'll work perfectly. I tell you what, even a water vapor, actually, Alan, we can even look at a little bit of some of the steering factors.
There is some influence that Nicole is having around it, is potentially having a feedback on the upper level ridging in the atmosphere up in here, which in a secondary role may have an impact on the track of Matthew. They're all related. There's no way to separate one from the other, but there's so many layers there, so many things that are sort of non-linearly interacting, one affecting the other, It's not possible to say that this is doing this to that, and that's why we're seeing it. There's all kinds of relationships in here, and their relationships with the storms and the overall steering pattern themselves. So it's a little bit too complicated to say one is just impacting the other.
I think everybody's thinking the favorite term, the Fujiwara,
Right.
which, in a most basic sense is tropical systems within, about 800 or 900 miles can sometimes, not always, have a role on each other in terms of interaction. Which,
That's right.
sure, that's a distinctly possible thing, but Matthew is also a larger and more powerful system. I know Nicole is strengthening and is up to 70 miles an hour and has been trying to produce an eye at times, but at this point, you're still 100 miles from the coast of Florida. I don't think it's going to do anything to deviate the track significantly at this point for Florida, which is the takeaway for them.
Yeah, here's one point too, is that the cone, or I should say the tracks for Matthew were confident in showing this movement that it's going through now long before Nicole really entered the picture too. So the guidance was telling us Matthew was going to do its thing like it is now without regard to Nicole. I think that's maybe one way to look at it.
Exactly. Anything you want to take away from on your overall water vapor picture in terms of some steering, anything that interests you regarding Matthew?
It's hard to see on this picture. It's a good question, Brandon, but it's hard to look at the steering patterns here. I mean, you can sort of get a broad brush view of what the upper level airflow looks like, but really overall, now there's just some ridging right out over here. You can see that, and Matthew is helping to perhaps inflate some of the ridging over here. So, in other words, the jet stream may be getting deflected a little bit farther to the north up in here. But overall, I don't really see much in that. The next trough to come in, you can see coming into the west, ones have a winter weather update snow potential. That's coming in. That's eventually going to be, I think, helping to push Matthew out. But
it's interesting to even look at the water vapor picture on Matthew. This is the first I've seen of it today. You can still see, it's still a very potent system, but it's not this symmetric, classic-looking hurricane that it was prior to going across Haiti. When it was down in the Caribbean, it was a Category 5. It had a nice-looking eye. It was clear. Very well-breathing storm. Very symmetrical. All that. Now it looks a little more asymmetric in nature. That's not to say that it's changed up the fact that it's still a Category 4 with 140-mile-an-hour winds, but given what we saw in Haiti, it looks like the storm is not doing quite as well, even though it's still a potent.
it's a very
potent
dangerous
storm.
Category 4. I think that's what
the
we had.
takeaway.
That's the takeaway. It's a very dangerous Cat 4. We're going to get some visible images in here. We got to wrap this up here, but let's go. There's Nicole. Let's zoom in tight. Right here. Keep going. Okay, now can you move it over? There's the eye. My gosh, this is a beautiful picture. There's the eye, guys, right in here. Can you see that? Right in here. And surrounding that is the eye wall, which has that 100+ mile per hour wind right in here. That is about 150 miles or so east of Miami, and that is moving that way, and it is going to get very close to the Florida coast tonight. Can you see that?
Just pause it, Rios. let's just pause it for a second, because you can actually, I mean, it's, satellite picture, radar pictures, whatever, but you can almost see it looks like a full-on donut. It almost looks like it's...
The radar
complete.
suggests that it is. There's no doubt about that. And there's a little bit of a moat region up in here. I mean, there's some areas that are precipitation free, just cirrus clouds in there. But watch out. My takeaway from this, the most destructive winds by far are going to be in that eye wall. If you want to know where the winds over 100 miles per hour are going to be, it's in the eye wall. And if you want to track that, monitor it in real time, stay tuned to your local authorities, follow your trusted source. We'll be here with you the whole time. I'll be on 5 a.m. tomorrow morning, so catching some of the landfall probably. Stay tuned here for all the latest. I mean, we are not going to leave you hanging out to dry on this one.
No, we're 24/7 from now until we're done with Matthew. Pop the radar on just real quick, Alan, on that exact same frame. Just want to see, just so everybody can see it from what you would look at. So there you go. Again, that's the core of everything. But
There's that moat region we were talking about right in here. You can see there's the cirrus clouds right in here. So there's not much precipitation. This is the business end of Matthew right in there. And hopefully, well, unfortunately, I think it's going to move into the Florida coast tonight.
Yep. All right. Well, that's it for us. Again, tune to the Weather Channel. We'll be on. We're on day and night, 24/7. We have expert analysis. We're talking with local governments, providing you all the information we can on Matthew. In fact,
Latest advisory just
Alex,
came in.
pull it up real quick. We've waited. We happened to catch it early. There it is. You see it coming on right now. That is Hurricane Matthew 2 p.m. advisory. Still 140 miles per hour. They went to 939 on the pressure.
Incremental change, not really substantial. It's holding its own. It's holding steady on its close approach.
Exactly. Track real quick just to show it one more time. I don't think there's probably any significant changes in the 2 o'clock being an intermediate advisory. But again, still right along the Florida coast overnight tonight into tomorrow, through Georgia and the Carolina coast into the weekend, and then still having that turn back out. But again, all the way through all of this, we're on. We're tracking it. Smart guys like this guy right here, a bunch of other people. Greg Costello, Carl Parker, Brian Norcross, Jim Cantor. We've got live presence everywhere.
Michael Lowry.
Michael Lowry. I can't forget Michael Lowry.
He's the storm surge wizard around here.
Yes, he is a storm surge expert. He is on overnight tonight. He is one very smart guy when it comes to that stuff. Tune in for him. But we will be here for you. So thank you very much.
Cool, man.